When I was in school, I learned how to do two things: roll paper into a cylinder and fold paper into a cube. These two concepts are the foundation of what I do today, but we're not worried about the cube just yet. Anytime anything moves, it is just one cylinder sliding inside of another. That's it. Every actual joint or point of articulation on my models is fundamentally the same, but it's the size of the joints and how they attach to each other that can get pretty complicated. There are three sections that comprise what I call the T-joint: the pin, the pivot, and the lever. The pin is glued to a piece of card or something where it and the lever are fixed to the body, leaving the pivot free to rotate 360 degrees in a singular direction. This is how an elbow or knee joint would bend. Or, if you flip it this way, it could be a shoulder or a hip, or the ankle, or the wrist, or the neck. You get the idea. I always start with the pin since it's at the center of everything. I actually use two different widths of paper here for the two layers. The first is just rolled up and sticky taped together, then the second layer is about 4 to 5 millimeters narrower and is stuck around the first layer using double-sided tape. I find that double-sided tape works really well and is really good for tightly wrapping paper into the solid shapes I need. I also use some sticky tape here around the pin to smooth out the surface so the paper doesn't get caught in the joint's rotation. After that, I add the pivot. Again, this part has to be very solid, so I use double-sided tape, allowing me to wrap it as tightly as possible, except this time the tape is flipped the other way, so it is sticking to itself and not the pin. I don't want the pin and pivot actually stuck together in any way, as this is where the movement comes from. But I do want the pivot wrapped as tightly as possible around the pin, which is what I'm doing here. Next, I roll the third cylinder, which will become the lever, and then I use a piece of card with double-sided tape to wrap around the pivot and then the lever too. But first I add some glue before slotting the lever to the pivot and inside the card, where the card is then folded around the cylinder here and more glue is added where it can be, just to make everything as strong as possible. I then use sticky tape to further pull everything together, making this as solid as possible. I also want to keep the round shape of the cylinder here as well. This will be important later. Okay. So here I take the pin out and glue it to a piece of card. I trace a circle using the edge of the pin, which remember is slightly thinner at the edge, so I can cut out the circle and then glue the pin both to and through the piece of card. You see, the thinner layer of the pin goes through the piece of card and is glued from the other side, while the thicker layer is just glued directly to the card. Reinforcing the joint from both sides like this is what makes everything so solid. Now, before you attach the other side of the pin to the card, you need to do the most crucial step, and that is tightening the joints so they are strong enough to actually support the weight of the model. You don't want your characters buckling at the knees. How strong the joint is depends entirely on how tightly the pivot is wrapped around the pin, on how much friction there is. To increase the friction, I stick thin pieces of tape around the pivot, making the joint stronger. So what I do is I feed the tape through the hole and then I stick it around the outside. And I just keep doing this until I think the joints are tight enough. And that is a judgment I have to make every time. And I use the flawless method of guessing and hoping. It's really just trial and error. It's not something I get right every time. In fact, I get it wrong so frequently it can become frustrating. I mean, too much tape and the joint just gets stuck and doesn't want to move at all. Or sometimes it only rotates in one direction. And every time it's too tight or too loose, I have to remove the pin, which can result in it getting squashed and eventually being unusable. But when I am happy with the joint and believe it can support the weight it is supposed to, I then just wrap the piece of card the pin is glued to around and glued on the other side, just like the first time. As you might have noticed, the pin is actually a few millimeters wider than the pivot, And this is because the glue can overflow a little bit, and if there isn't a gap, the pivot will also be glued and nothing will move at all. That's not okay. For every character that I make, I have a reference for that character that I drew. This is where I can figure out the art style, color palette, and what changes I want to make to the design, and most notably, the proportions. The height, the shoulder width, the leg length, the size of the head, all of it is calculated down to the very millimeter when I make these drawings. And when I am making the joints for the character, I make sure that it all fits in through the body nicely. So this is how all the joints line up with my drawing. And now all that's left to do is to connect the joints together using more tubes of paper. I really just start attaching things using as much glue or double-sided tape as possible to make it as sturdy as possible. And that doesn't always happen, but that's the fun of it. So now let's put this guy together. Usually start by attaching the shoulders first, and really the shoulders is just one big tube of paper going across that the shoulder joints slide inside and the neck joint slides around on the outside. Although in the case of the Armored Titan, since his shoulders are kind of hunched up, I thought I would make the shoulders at a slight angle instead of just being a straight horizontal tube. But in hindsight that wasn't really necessary, and it just made things more difficult than they needed to be. So as you can see, all my figures actually have this bar going across here, where the arms slide into and the neck attaches around. And you can literally see right through a character. That's what I did for Kenshiro, that's what I did for Cell, and it's also what I did for the Armored Titan as well. He is no different. But seeing as I already made this part for the Armored Titan, we'll start with the hips, which are made in the same way. Now these two cylinders I have here for the levers on the hips don't have the exact same circumference. So what I have to do is I have to roll two separate cylinders for each of the hips and then stick them together, forming one bigger cylinder. So I simply just get about half a page length of paper, with double-sided tape of course, that is about the same width as the length of the lever on the joint you are using, and wrap it around as neatly and tightly as possible, and I do it for both of course. Now this is why the lever for the joint here actually has to be a pretty neat and tidy cylinder in of itself, with some sticky tape wrapped around so the edges of paper don't get caught as the extra cylinder, as the cylinder that goes around it rotates. This is how you get 2 points of articulation out of every joint you make. You'll get the twist here, and then of course you'll get the extension there. Now here I get another piece of paper, and its width is equal to the combined total of these two cylinders here. And since they still have the double-sided tape on them, I'll just stick them next to each other here. Add some glue, attach the next one. And as you can see, these two cylinders here aren't the exact same circumference, so it's not going to be a perfectly round cylinder, this one. But that doesn't matter. And it gives us more gaps to put more glue in. And this is going to be connected to the big waist joint via two tubes of paper that are going to just be attached here and here, making just a simple square out of 4 cylinders of paper. I wrap a piece of card around the cylinder that the hips go into, and I take yet another tube of paper that is going around the lever of the waist joint. After adding some more glue, I then stick this to the hips here. And now this will be the hips that will attach to the legs and the waist. Okay, so here I'm just going to be attaching a piece of card around the cylinder that the shoulders are sliding into, where another cylinder of paper will be glued in here, forming a pillar of sorts that will attach to the waist joint, making the structure of the upper body. So as you can see, I have the two pieces of card here attached to either side of the waist joint, and they are just being glued to the two pillars I attached, or the two cylinders of paper I attached to the shoulders. And that's really it. I just need to keep attaching as much card
and glue until I think it will be strong enough to support the whole upper body's weight. Now moving on to the arms, it is literally just each of the shoulder, elbow and wrist joints being stuck to each other. And the wrist here actually has another cylinder of paper around it that will allow for a twisting motion. And that cylinder on the outside of the wrist will just be glued inside the piece of card on the elbow joint, and then I just sticky tape it to hold it together, and that's really it. And then the elbow joint is the same thing. The elbow joint is the same thing, where I just stick some double-sided tape inside the shoulder joint, or the lever of the elbow joint will actually just be attached inside the piece of card on the shoulder joint. Now here I'm actually going to be cutting a bit of card to make the piece of card for the shoulder joint at a bit of an angle. And this is because the shoulders on human anatomy actually sit at an angle since it attaches to the collarbone just like the chest. And again, here's that cylinder I mentioned that will be attaching inside the shoulder joint. And I just use glue to strengthen it like I have been doing all along. Now quickly cutting to the ankle here. The ankle is a little bit unique because the ankle joint here only has the pin and then the pivot. There's no lever yet. And that's because the lever will be the piece of card, the piece of card around the actual ankle joint that moves forward and backwards. And so I just wrap a piece of card around the pivot, and then I stick the pivot to the pin of the other ankle joint, I guess. And this is what allows the foot to move forward and backward while also being able to pivot side to side. Now here is the knee joint, and the knee joint will just be attaching to the cylinder around the ankle joint. Again, each of the levers on the joints have an extra cylinder of paper around them, so that way they can get the twisting motion as well. And I just make sure it's equal length with the other leg, and then I'll just be gluing it inside there. And now I'm going to attach yet another cylinder of paper to the top of the knee joint, the piece of card for the knee joint, and that will just be glued in there, and that will be made a smooth cylinder as well. Here I'm attaching yet another piece of card with some glue inside it to strengthen the knee joint a bit further. And then I'm just wrapping some paper around the thigh here, which is the cylinder attached to the top of the knee joint, to get it pretty even. To make sure it's a smooth cylinder so it can rotate inside yet another cylinder of paper. Here I'm just sliding the ankle inside the lower leg. And then since the lower part of the knee is actually going to be visible, so I'm actually attaching just a piece of paper with the proper color scheme that I want, which in the case of the Armored Titan is just going to look like red muscle tissue. And so here I've actually wrapped another cylinder of paper around the cylinder formed in the knee, and that external cylinder will go inside the hip, like you can see here, and then that will just be stuck in with double-sided tape and glue, and then that's it. That's how I make the leg and the arm. And as you can see, in the case of the Armored Titan, since he's so big, the joints I had to make really tight, and so that a single piece of card isn't strong enough. You can see it's actually bending before the joint itself is moving here. So you saw earlier I did this with the knee, and all I do here is I just add some glue there, and then attach another piece of card the opposite way, and then add some more glue, of course. And then I just cut out a piece of the card so the joint can actually fold down, as that's what the hip needs to be doing. This will just slide into the hip section, and it's done.
Now, I don't always use the exact same method for every character. It can vary depending on the character. I mean, I'm a creator. I can't help but try new things. I also want each of my characters to be different from each other by expressing their own unique qualities, just as each individual person in the real world is unique and different in their own way. For example, Spider-Man is extremely flexible and is often found in some insanely dynamic positions, so I wanted him to have a range of motion in his joints with some added points of articulation to achieve this. Or Cell has more of a bug-like structure with some clear separation between his softer muscle tissue underneath and his hardened armor-like shell, so I wanted that separation to be a feature of his movement. There is still a lot I haven't shown in this video, as how I build something depends heavily on what that something is. And there are many things I didn't cover or mention in this video, like the double joints seen on Cell and Spider-Man, or how to make the neck, but that will come in the future. This video is just the start. Moving forward, I'd like to do specific tutorials on characters as I make them, going into a little more detail on the things that are unique to the character.
like Spider-Man's web shooters, Superman's lasers, or how I would make a giant cybernetic gauntlet. I didn't have any rules to follow when I was 10 years old and decided to make my own toys. I just had imagination. I don't want people to try to replicate my work. I want people to try and make something of their own. So if you're going to create something yourself, use this video as inspiration, not instruction. Thank you for watching.